In the late summer of 1776, all eyes were on New York City. Considered by some to be a bulwark of Washington's defense, yeah. Considered by some to be a bulwark of Washington's defenses, and by others a Tory nest of vipers, the island at the center of the world was seen as the linchpin of the war in the Americas. It would, in the space of a few months, see blockade, bombardment, amphibious assault, and one of the largest battles of the war before becoming the British headquarters in North America for the next 7 years. Shortly after the Union flag was raised once again over the battery, however, a fire roared through the city, complicating the occupation, raising questions of espionage and brutality, and reinventing New York's image for a generation. Tonight, Benjamin Carp, award-winning author and professor of history at the City University of New York, joins us to discuss New York City, the British occupation, the urbanization of the American Revolution, and the fire that changed America. This is, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen, Broadway is Burning. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars podcast, where once again we are on the other side of the Atlantic. I'm Luke Reynolds, and even though I'm joined by Zach White, we're very much in my territory geographically, because today we're talking about my city, New York. Not New York as it is, however, but New York as it was, when redcoats stood guard and the pride of the Royal Navy anchored safely in the harbor. To talk about occupied New York, along with the fire that destroyed more than a fifth of it, we've invited Benjamin Carp onto the podcast. Professor Carp is a professor of history at City University of New York's Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center, my own alma mater, and he is the author of three very well-received books. First, Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution, which was published by Oxford in 2007. Then Defiance of the Patriots, The Boston Tea Party and the Making of America, which was published by Yale in 2010 and won the Triennial Society of the Cincinnati Cox Book Prize in 2013. And finally, The Great New York Fire of 1776, a lost story of the American Revolution, which Yale brought out in 2023. Thank you for joining us, sir, and how are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
As am I. When Zach tasked me with bringing more of the American side onto this, I knew I had to get you on here to talk about New York and the fire and generally just sort of the urbanization of the revolution as it was. All right, so we're going to jump into this because if I let Zach speak now, he'll be at this for half an hour. So,
Oh, rude, unnecessary,
all right,
accurate,
fair,
but
accurate,
utterly
but
unnecessary.
that's fair. That's fair. All right, so let's start with what to you and me is a little inside baseball. As New York residents, this one seems obvious to the two of us. But for my co-host and our listeners who are further afield, can you explain why New York City was considered so important to all sides during the American War of Independence?
Yeah, it's funny. You're reminding me that the very first sentence of the book is New York City was the most important spot on the map in 1776. And I was presenting this book in Los Angeles, and a scholar who I won't name, a senior scholar from Philadelphia, said, "What do you mean New York City is the most important spot on the map? What about Boston? What about Philadelphia?" Well, Boston was evacuated by the British Army in 1776. Okay, during the summer they do write the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. So okay, there's some importance there, but it wasn't clear to anyone at the time that the Declaration of Independence was going to be as meaningful as it became to Americans later on in 1776, right? I mean, it's a declaration, but that declaration had to be backed up with arms. And where are the men under arms, and where are they focusing their attention in 1776? That's New York City.
So what we've got here fundamentally is, context. I'm going to dig. I'm not going to ask you to reveal who that academic was, but I love a bit of beef on this podcast. And so I'm very curious about the debate that's underpinning that. So is this essentially a contest over arguments of where the spiritual home of the revolution is versus practical? I mean, is there kind of a division of, well, look, economic practicalities, population concentration versus the importance that's been imbued in Philadelphia over time because of, as you say, the Declaration?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating question because you have to simultaneously answer what were people's perspective in 1776, and then also how did subsequent generations think about these historic events. I mean, Philadelphia is larger than New York City in 1776, it's true, and it does become the place where the Continental Congress meets. But whereas we might think of that as, the central government, of course, that's the most important place. Scholars of the American Revolution know that American authority is so diffuse that no one geographic spot could ever be accorded full leadership. Now, as far as the spiritual home of the revolution, right, Boston gets to be the city of firsts, right, the place of the Stamp Act riots and the Liberty Riot and the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, and the first place where the kind of clash of arms takes place just outside Boston in Lexington and Concord, followed by the siege of Boston, right? So Boston, as always, is the city of firsts, right? Philadelphia becomes, known as, yeah, the seat of government, the place where these very famous documents, not just the Declaration of Independence, but also later the U.S. Constitution, where those documents are debated, written up, and signed. And so, as far as a spiritual home, and also places that have been very good about preserving buildings and giving tourists something to see, right? If you think about revolutionary America in our cities, you might well want to go to Boston. You might well want to go to Philadelphia. Even Charleston and Newport, which did not become as important commercial cities later in their history, right? Those are still excellent places to see 18th century architecture, and really get a feel for what the city is like. New York City gives you very little opportunity to see what a revolutionary city would have looked like. My predecessor at Brooklyn College, Ted Burroughs, the author of Gotham, said that there are three existing pre-revolutionary structures surviving in Manhattan. First, you've got Morris Jumel Mansion, which is in Washington Heights and was actually the Morris Mansion had been Washington's headquarters in September of 1776. You've got St. Paul's Cathedral on Broadway, which is also part of my story. And then you've got the fence around Bowling Green. And so if you want to have a sense of structures from pre-revolutionary Manhattan, that's really it. And so New York City is not the kind of place that has preserved its colonial or revolutionary history very well. If you're standing in Lower Manhattan with the giant skyscrapers of the financial district, it is very hard to squint and imagine yourself in an 18th century city of 25,000 people. The other thing about New York City is that during the years 1775, 1776, New York City had a reputation, probably an unfair one among New Englanders, of dragging its feet when it came to resisting what the British were doing. That New York was slow, that it was full of loyalists, that it was too moderate, that it was not doing its part to resist what Parliament was trying to do. And so New York already sort of has this loyalist reputation. And then it's occupied by the British in September of 1776, and is then occupied all the way for the rest of the war until the British finally evacuate. It's the last place in the 13 colonies that they evacuate in November of 1783. And so that's 8 years of serving the British tea and beer and being military contractors for them and repairing their ships, and essentially, as one scholar puts it, acting as collaborators with the British. So that does nothing to enhance New York City's patriotic reputation. So New York City is still, I think, one of the most interesting places to study of the Revolutionary War, and I think it is the heart of the Revolutionary War in a lot of ways. But one thing it does not do is match up well with a patriotic story that Americans might want to tell themselves. It's a fascinating place to look at loyalists, Hessian soldiers, members of the British Army and Navy. It's a great place to look at an example of an American occupation, right? The Continental Army is occupying New York City from, depending on how you count, about April of 1776 through September, right? We're not used to kind of thinking about American occupations of cities, but this is a good example of one. And so there's all sorts of fascinating stories that one can tell, to say nothing of fugitive slaves. Many of these formerly enslaved people, then left with the British Army in 1783. So there's all sorts of fascinating stories that one can tell, and stories about the revolution that one can encapsulate by looking at New York City during the Revolutionary War. But it is not normally a place that you think of as a tourist attraction for thinking about the American Revolution.
See, as you say this, the penny is now dropping with me about why the Beau didn't write Who Owned the American Revolution. Now, obviously, I'm being slightly facetious because quite obviously the answer to that is, well, the Americans owned the American Revolution. But yeah, it's interesting to hear about the lack of interest in sort of the preservation of some of these sites. But then, you've kind of explained about how for New York, it's not as clear cut. These aren't necessarily sites of great heroism. And I had always wondered this. In fact, I have a feeling that Luke and I had a conversation about if I went to New York, where do I go to see the key sites of the revolution? And he basically turned around and said, well, there's a lot of concrete there now. It doesn't really work.
Yeah, I mean, there are some sites that you can go to in the outer boroughs. I want to make clear. There are places that you can go to in Staten Island, in Brooklyn, in Queens, and in the Bronx, and see some more surviving 18th century mansions, even topography, from battlefields, right? If you go to Greenwood Cemetery or Prospect Park, it may not be very well marked, but one can reconstruct battlefield movements, et cetera, using, with an approximation of the glacial topography that would have existed in the 18th century. So, so really, I should say it's not all of New York City that is, not great for envisioning the 18th century, but Manhattan in particular, because it's so commercially valuable, they really paved over a lot of what we might use in order to, walk in the footsteps of those revolutionary soldiers on either side.
That's a really nice link actually to where we wanted to go next with this, which is to talk about what cities look like, and that sort of sounds quite odd at first glance. Well, it's a city. Everybody knows what a city looks like, right? Everybody's seen London and New York and all the rest of it. But this is very much the point, that actually strip things back to the 1700s, and there's a big difference in what constitutes a city. So you've got that disparity between what London might look like compared to what New York might have looked like. So talk us through, I guess, how cities within the US look in the late 18th century, the impact that that has on people, because the pace of life is inevitably very different to what's happening in Bristol, or Southampton's probably not a going concern at this point. Let's say Portsmouth or London or whatever it might be. How is that different? But also, how are people's lives shaped by that environment?
Yeah, I mean, the American seaport towns are small, right? There were big cities in the 18th century, London, Edo, Istanbul, Mexico City, but the American seaport towns were not. They are colonial outposts. The largest one is Philadelphia with 40,000 people. Second largest is New York with 25,000 people. By the time you get down to the fifth largest, you're talking under 10,000 people. So these are really very small places. Anyone who was a regular resident of the city might well have known anyone who they came across in the street. Now, that's not to say that there weren't new people coming in all the time. Merchant seamen, farmers selling their goods at market, enslaved people who were brought in as cargo, new arrivals, seasonal laborers, what have you, right? There would have been a lot of back and forth, and maybe a certain degree of the anonymity that we take for granted in modern cities. But if you think about the permanent residents of a city, you would have been talking about what we would consider very small towns, smaller than a lot of university populations nowadays. So, and as far as the landscape, right? If you would have looked at one of these cities from afar, the most prominent structures would have been church steeples. Maybe the tallest one would get 100 feet high, and then the masts of ships, right? So as far as you would see these tall wooden spires and masts, right, and sails, but you would not be seeing tall buildings and all the other things that we associate with modernity. So so these are walkable cities, right? Most of the American seaport towns were no longer than 2 miles across, so an easy walk in a day. And yeah, I mean, so I'm not sure what else to say about that, but the smallness of the city is something that I think we really ought to emphasize. And the estimates that I've seen would suggest that 95% of the 13 colonies were rural. Fewer than 5% of Americans lived in a place that had more than 2,500 people. So you're talking about seaport cities that are commercial entrepôts for rural produce and are certainly connected to the wider Atlantic world through shipping, but are not necessarily thriving metropolises in their own right.
And it is worth remembering and reminding our listeners. This is something that Professor Carp and I know relatively well. But New York City, if you can put the term city on it, stops basically where Brooklyn Bridge intersects with Manhattan Island. It's that and below. That's all there is city-wise in 1776.
Yeah, that's about right. I mean, the rest of Manhattan Island was very sparsely populated. There's a concentration of buildings in what's now Harlem. There are some farmsteads and suburban estates, scattered throughout the island. But yeah, the urbanized part of Manhattan is really just the triangle at the very tip of Manhattan Island.
There's a small fishing village called Greenwich, I believe, somewhere along
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
The Hudson coast. All right. So I mean, based on what you're saying, right? You've written an entire book on cities in the American Revolution. And given the size of these places, you must have had your work cut out for you. Given 95% of the colonies are rural. So so talk us through the part that cities played in all of this.
Yeah, what I had to argue in that first book is that despite the small size of the cities, they were disproportionate in their importance, right? As centers of communication, as commercial locations, as political centers, right? Because generally the capitals of each of the colonies were located in the largest seaport cities. As cultural centers, as places that got a lot of attention in terms of the social world of the colonies, right? So the cities are, and then also as centers of resistance and violence. So for all those reasons, even though the bulk of the population is living in places that largely grow food and other produce, the cities still have this outsized role, particularly when you're thinking about the coming of the war.
I'm reminded of one of my favorite parts when I teach this. And I know I mostly teach world history these days, so I can no longer go into the level of detail that you can. But sort of explaining to my students the sort of that sort of feeling of you think there's one more step and there isn't when you're climbing stairs and you hit the floor and you almost trip. That Britain experiences when they try and stop this war and they keep playing by the European rules of we take the cities, we take the capitals, and it's supposed to be over, and it's not.
Right. There's no one place that you can conquer in America and say, okay, now this territory has surrendered. And in fact, the Americans brag about this constantly in the first year of the war. Charles Royster points this out, that the Americans are like, they can take our seaport cities and we will, flee to the backwoods and make our stand there, right? Americans are constantly saying this. They know there is space where they can escape from British warships and troop landings, and regroup. And in fact, if you look at Washington, not in 1776, but throughout the rest of the war, where is he making his encampments? Valley Forge, Morristown, Newburgh, right? Places where he can hide in the hills and stay out of the reach of the British Army and Navy, which is tied to the seacoast because a lot of their provisions and other logistical support is going to have to come from across the Atlantic, to say nothing of renewed troop movements and things like that.
Apologies for a deep dive into an area that really isn't sort of the focus of this interview, but bearing in mind that the British strategy is we take the population centers and then we're going to win because then we'll have claimed the states, right? And the Americans turn around and go, no, you fundamentally misunderstood how this place works.
Well, what they hoped, right, was that there was a latent population of loyalists who would flock to their banner. And if you think about it, maybe that might have worked. If most of the countryside's farmers were inclined to stay within the fold of the British Empire, then yes, if you take the city, then all of a sudden those loyalist farmers want to come to markets, they want to buy things there, and that economically you would be able to reconstruct the British Empire and you would be able to kind of affirm everyone's political allegiance by doing so. So in theory, this should have worked. But of course, one of the classic things to say about the American Revolution is that the British were constantly overestimating the amount of loyalist support that they would find.
With that in mind, does that effectively make I mean, I refer to it as the American Revolution more than the War of Independence, but does it make the conflict fundamentally unwinnable for the British?
That is the art. I mean, one of the best books on the revolution recently was Andrew O'Shaughnessy's The Men Who Lost America, which focuses on the British political and military leaders and basically saying these guys were not incompetent. They were just trying to win a war that couldn't be won. And it's not as if O'Shaughnessy is the first person to make that argument, but it's a compelling one that there was very little that the British could do in order to bring the Americans back into the fold. I mean, this is the classic problem in any civil war, is that once you've got a population that has decided they are done with this distant government, and once blood has been shed and there's lingering feelings of resentment about that, it's very difficult to kind of restore a population to its allegiance. And without political support and without the support of public opinion, it's very difficult to see how the British would have then won. I mean, they try, they say, hey, we'll repeal all the laws going back to 1765. We'll do everything that you're asking of us, et cetera, et cetera. They try this for one last time, really, in 1778. And the American leadership insists, we are not interested. And the people who have sent us to be delegates to this Continental Congress are not interested in that. Of course, there are pockets of loyalists and pockets of neutral people and people who just wanted to be left alone. But the American rebels had been effective at asserting and consolidating power, despite their, the fact that they were in financial shambles, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, obviously, midway through the war, they gain France as their allies, and that changes the game for them because now, of course, the British are not just trying to put down a local rebellion, but having to deal with the English Channel and India and the Caribbean and and worrying and the Mediterranean and worrying about the French and then the Spanish and the Dutch in all these other places. I mean, Britain, which had been able to count on allies in almost every other war of the long 18th century, is relatively friendless during the Revolutionary War. And so the American rebels get very, very lucky in that respect, which is that after the 7 Years' War, after the Peace of Paris of 1763, a lot of other places were really resentful of how powerful the British had become. And they're kind of rubbing their hands gleefully as they run into this massive uprising in North America.
Yeah, Britain suddenly finds itself the player in the board game that everyone else realizes is winning, and everyone gangs up on them to sort of bring them back into their place. All right, so we have these cities that are disproportionately important, that but are relatively small, and have this as we've made it very clear, lack the sort of European style. He's taken my capital, therefore I must surrender. Which, in fairness, Europe learns from, right? Napoleon marches into Moscow thinking I've won this, and the Russians go, nope. So it does sort of play.
The Moscow comparison may come up later in this conversation, by the way.
Excellent. Oh yeah, of course it will. That makes perfect sense. But I want to talk about where someplace that cities do basically dominate, which is culture, right? And talking about what we've been talking about a little bit, and sort of we're jumping ahead to the aftermath. But I'm really interested in cities and sort of remembrance, right? And we've talked about how Boston and Philly, you can walk through them and see portions of this. Like there's the Revolutionary Trails and there's Independence Hall and all that. And New York just sort of takes one look at this and just goes, nope, we're good. We're gonna become the financial capital of this side of the Atlantic instead.
One might argue that that is the ultimate expression of New York's culture, right? Whereas Philadelphia could say, ah, yes, we were founded by Quakers. We are the Quaker city. And the people of Boston could say, ah, yes, the Congregationalists, right? They founded Boston as the kind of principal city of New England, and this was a place for dissenters, independent of that kind. Whereas New York City is a commercial place, right? New Amsterdam had originally been Dutch. The British take it over, but it was always a diverse place of French Huguenots and Walloons and people of African descent and Jews and Scots Irish Presbyterians, right? It's always a mix. These people are linked by their fondness for drinking and their fondness for making money, right? There is no other singular cultural characteristic that would link New Yorkers. That isn't to say that it didn't have a moneyed elite, right, and a kind of high style. And that isn't to say that there wasn't a particular culture to New Yorkers, middle class and working class. There certainly was. But a lot of that just gets erased by subsequent generations of immigration and money making, right? New York is a place where you go to make money and where people from all across the social spectrum are trying to come there in order to join these industries and make a life for their families. And so that is both a sort of explanation for why New York looks the way it does in 1776, but also explains why the New York of 1776 is then kind of erased and forgotten by subsequent generations. It's an uncomfortable story to tell. And while in the early 19th century, there's an interest in, oh, let's revive that old Dutch culture. That's actually where how Santa Claus is sort of invented. So even though there is this interest in kind of reviving that culture and saying, well, which of these old Protestant cultures can we preserve as the Irish come in and the Germans come in, and then later the Italians and Jews and other ethnic groups come in, right? Like, so that desire to hold on to old New York becomes this kind of patrician anti-immigrant desire. But at this point, we're not really talking about the American Revolution at all anymore.
Much though we don't do stereotyping on this show, I did rather enjoy your comment about the idea that drinking and making money are sort of core aspects of the New Yorker's psyche, which does make me wonder whether we can class the Beau as a true New Yorker, because he's a historian, so he's clearly not into making money. And he's not known for his drinking either, beyond the occasional port. So basically, Beau, are you even a New Yorker?
The amount of black in my wardrobe would say yes, as would my inherent multiculturalism, is what I would argue there. That is a very valid point. What I will say is that I have never comfortably existed in the New York that is south of Wall Street, and I think that fits that model pretty well.
That's
It's
because they don't like tweed in Wall Street.
Well, there's that, but it's also because it's all about making money and drinking. Uh, and those are two things. There's a reason that, there is no CUNY on Wall Street. It's you have to go north or south in order to get there.
Isn't that
You know,
Center for Labor History near there, though?
there is. No, there absolutely is. Yeah, no, that's a fair comment. That's fair. So I have this is something, I I've obviously taught this for years, including at Brooklyn College, under your sort of gimlet eye. Um,
You might have
and
been
but
the first person I ever observed,
Oh
actually.
God, that's a
Come to think of it.
horrifying thought.
Can I just
Um,
say, I really feel for you, because he's bad enough now. So Lord knows what he was like back along.
I think his claim to being a New Yorker has to be tested by his pronunciation of the word coffee. Um, right. If you can't say coffee, I mean, I
Coffee.
lost my Long Island accent, which you can see on videos of me when I was a child. I lost it in college,
Hmm.
but I can call it back when necessary.
Coffee. The other one I would say is water.
Water. Yeah.
Water, because it's not water, it's water. Um, yeah. But here's a question that literally just popped into my head, and I this is not something I've ever considered before. Right? We make a big deal about this whole sort of the cities don't matter during the revol they matter before the revolution. Then sort of tactically they don't matter. Does there have to be urges to sort of make them matter again afterwards? Or does the inherent commercialization of America and like the trade automatically drive the population back into cities?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, and it's something I tried to think about in the epilogue of my first book. I mean, one of the interesting things that happens in the United States is that a lot of the 13 colonies move their capitals inland, right? Rosie Zagari talks about this in her first book, actually. Boston's capital stays where it was. Sorry, Massachusetts' capital stays where it was in Boston, but New York moves its to Albany. Pennsylvania will eventually move its to Harrisburg. South Carolina will move its capital to Columbia. So a lot of the cities that had been of premier, the seacoast cities that have been of premier importance during the colonial period retain their economic importance, but lose a bit of their political power. Which is a sort of interesting phenomenon. I don't think I answered your question entirely, but there is a way in which the yeah, no, sorry, I forgot a little bit of your initial question, so
No, but that
I can
tracks.
readdress.
No,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. That absolutely does track, and it is, it's one of those things where, people. especially tourists, come to New York and they're like, why is this not the capital of New York State? And part of it is that just that Albany is perpetually pissed off at us. But I think
But
that's.
but there
Go
was a
ahead,
real
sorry.
desire maybe to kind of say like, okay, we do not want our political legislators to be overly influenced either by commercial and moneyed elites or by working class crowds, right? And so the
Yeah,
way to take those influences out of government to some degree is to move the capital to a more central location for the farmers. And in modern times, it's a way for states to deny funding to urban populations, right? And to kind of outvote them and in a variety of ways.
absolutely. There's also the inherent sort of, what makes a city very good for trade almost automatically makes it terrible to defend. And so if you're going to
Right.
put your capital elsewhere.
Right. You want to choose a city for its openness and for the easy access of its harbor. But yes, that is the exact same thing that's going to invite a navy right into your backyard.
Especially when you're deciding to pick two wars in 30 years or 40 years with the country with the most powerful navy on earth at the time.
Yeah.
Uh,
But it's
even
not as if the colonial cities hadn't tried to fortify to some degree, right? There were some fortifications, there were cannon emplacements, et cetera. They worried from time to time about the French or the Spanish, or other seafaring powers. But as far as the having the funding to keep that up, it varies.
yeah.
Well, in the inimitable words of Ridley Scott, the thing that makes the British great, of course, or at least makes them think that they're great, is that they've got boats. There we go. We've
Very,
ticked that one off
very
the
true.
we've ticked that one off the bingo card of this podcast. Me having a pop at Ridley Scott. It is a time-honored tradition on this show. Um, let's talk about the fire that is kind of at the core of your most recent book. Luke very sort of eloquently describes it, the blaze on Broadway. Um, so the Howe
Okay,
brothers.
actually, hang on. I have to interrupt this because I know Professor Carp got that reference, but I'm not sure you did, Zach. So there's a very famous moment in New York history when it's a huge heat wave. No one has air conditioning yet. There's rolling blackouts, and there's a huge bunch of riots and problems all over the city. And the one thing sort of holding a portion of the population together is the success of the New York Yankees. And so out of this comes the headline, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning," and that's what that's a reference to.
Okay, I thought as you started to interrupt me, I genuinely thought you were going to try and explain Broadway to me. It wouldn't be the
Not even
first.
I am that patronizing.
It's sort of like the
Mm,
West End, but the New York version. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Although I mean, he may be what I thought he was referencing actually was the article that I first published on the fire back in 2006, which was the night the Yankees burned Broadway. Um,
See, he's going to nod and pretend that, that was always his intent. Whether or not it actually was is something that only he can know. Um,
It wasn't, but I do thoroughly recommend that article. It's an excellent read.
Look, the beautiful thing about being as a historian is that we have the power to then craft the narrative and ascribe intent however we wish. Um,
indeed, indeed. Okay, but focusing on the, am I really the one who's bringing this interview back on track? This is a strange position for me to be in as Dr. Rabbit Hole. The Howe brothers evict Washington from New York City in 1776. And then we have sort of the Great Fire of New York, if you will. Talk us through essentially what happens. How does this thing start? How widespread? What is the scale of the impact within the context of New York at the time?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to start the story of the fire because there are differing accounts of how it started. According to the American account later on, an accident happened on Whitehall Slip at the very tip of Manhattan Island, where the Staten Island ferry leaves from nowadays. A lantern got kicked over, or a bunch of drunks knocked over a candle, or something like that. The fire begins on Whitehall Slip, and then it gets out of control, and the wind blows it, and it burns a very large contiguous area where kind of the fire goes around Bowling Green, hops over Broadway, and then burns almost everything west of Broadway to the Hudson River, which represents, a geographer and I calculated, about a fifth of the city, 20% of the urbanized part of New York City at the time. According to eyewitnesses, most of whom were British or loyalist, but according to eyewitnesses, the fire broke out in several places at once, and they caught people in the act of trying to set New York City on fire. And some of the incendiary material that was found were in places that did not then burn down, but that wasn't perhaps for lack of trying. Either way, right, we know the extent of the damage that occurred. It was truly devastating. But as far as how the fire began, that is very much in dispute.
Yeah, as your book does a very good job of, right? Where you're pushing away from some of the conspiracy theories that sort of circle around this. And when you do talk about them, you really go into sort of how this shapes perceptions, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to talk about sort of the physical side of this thing, right? The wind spreads it. However it happens, it takes out about a fifth of New York City, which is a large chunk. Um, so in the aftermath of the fire, how does British New York look? And how does the fire change how the occupation occurs? And basically, do the British rebuild it over 7 years? Is that a way they see themselves as earning back the trust of the people in certain ways, or what's going on there?
Yeah, in some ways, New York City gets a little lucky, in that most of the city doesn't burn. Most of the commercially most important part of the city doesn't burn. What burns? The Customs House, the Lutheran Church, Trinity Church, which was the largest of the Anglican churches, a few of the mansions, although not all of them, along Broadway, and then a tremendous amount of working class housing, most of which were on Trinity Church lands, Church of England lands, west of Broadway, including the red light district, supposedly. So it does not destroy any of the printing houses. It doesn't destroy most of the churches. It doesn't destroy any of the other government buildings. There's still, it doesn't destroy the shipyards, right? Importantly. So there's still a lot that New Yorkers can do to run their city. However, destroying all of that housing stock does end up having an impact for the rest of the British occupation. There are some very cold winters during the Revolutionary War, and these are times when the British probably reflected, hey, it would be nice to have a little bit more of a place to house all of these refugees, both white and black, who have come in from the countryside, our army and navy and the camp followers that had come with them, loyalist residents of New York City, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of people and newcomers who need a place to sleep during the winters in New York City, who now have 20% fewer places to sleep. And the British do not rebuild. They have other priorities, evidently, for building fortifications, other, logistical things. They're trying to pursue a military campaign. They do not go back and build New York. And so the neighborhood actually becomes known as Canvas Town, because what essentially it is a scattered bunch of brick husks with ship's canvas slung across the top to provide a sort of rude shelter for impoverished people of various kinds. And it isn't actually until a few years after the war that this is finally kind of cleared out and replaced with new buildings. So it's sort of a mini tragedy, but interestingly, if the Americans were trying to really kind of destroy and cripple New York, they did their best, but they sort of failed. Right? New York City is still able to be viable as a seaport for the remainder of the war.
And inevitably, when you take what ends up being tens of thousands of occupying troops, even if you've burnt down the red light district, the occupants of the red light district are going to have a fine time for the next 7 years, no matter what.
Yeah, the fire does not actually kill that many people. It was actually usually pretty easy to outrun an 18th century fire, right? Unlike in more modern times where you could be trapped in a tall building, with a door bolted closed and no fire escapes or something like that until fire codes are initiated. In the 18th century, you're probably not in a building any higher than 3 or 4 stories. You'll hear the noise, you will wake up and probably be able to outrun the fire. Of course, people were killed during fires in the 18th century, but generally only a handful. And I'm not aware, and New York City was relatively depopulated in September of 1776, but I'm not aware of anyone having died as a result of the fire unless the British caught someone who they thought was an arsonist in the act and either bayoneted them to death or threw them into a burning building. Those are the only people that I've seen evidence of having died as a result of this fire on the night of September 21st, 1776.
You talk about how the British don't rebuild. Does that ever become sort of a bit of a propaganda sort of gift for the revolutionary movement, in that sort of sense of, look, the British have come in and there's been this fire and they can't even be bothered to rebuild this place that they supposedly think is so important. Do you really want King George in charge, or do you want us in charge? It's a very easy thread to spin, but is that something that's seized upon at the time?
Yeah, it's not something I've seen. It's funny, I get asked questions so often about the aftermath of the fire and the rebuilding, and it's not something I've focused on to a tremendous degree. I mean, I know where to look to get better answers. It's mostly in the sort of Manhattan Common Council records and the city records and correspondence after the war was over. Um, I mean, one thing to think about is New York City is behind British lines. There is some porousness, right? There are people who cross over enemy lines, but you don't have a lot of narratives, in the American press of, oh, yes, I traveled, within British lines in New York City, and here's what I've heard, and et cetera, et cetera. Most of what we know about what the city looked like is more from private correspondence. There's not any evidence of the Americans trying to kind of make hay of the British failure to rebuild.
What about the other way around? What about the British pointing at this potential arson and going, do you really want to follow people that will burn their own city?
Well, that absolutely. So Charles Inglis, who was an Anglican minister, and Ambrose Searle, who was the secretary to Lord Richard Howe, the admiral, they run the New York Gazette and Weekly Mercury for a little while after the fire, after the British occupation, and they saw that newspaper as a way to kind of put out newspapers with more of a British slant. And in the aftermath of the fire, that is absolutely what they say. They say New Yorkers, and they imagine these New Yorkers to be kind of potentially open to British allegiance. They say, New Yorkers, those of you who trusted this rebel government, look what you got back in exchange for that trust. The Americans have just burned this city deliberately. They are obviously a horrible people, and you shouldn't follow them. So the British do, initially try and make a public opinion coup out of this. But the truth is, and I argue this in the book, is that because they don't sustain that line of criticism, and in some ways they couldn't, because of course the British had burned a bunch of American towns as well at that point and continue to do so throughout the war. But the British maybe might have had an opportunity to kind of keep keep up that line of look at how horrible the Americans are in burning their own towns, and maybe they might have been able to sway public opinion further. But I sort of argue in the book that they sort of dropped the matter. I think partly because they were embarrassed that the British, as I said, had burned so many towns themselves, and they also might have been embarrassed by some of the summary executions that were committed on the night of the fire.
We're talking a lot here about the way in which you're very keen to sort of deal with the conspiracy theory element and make sure that it's put firmly in its box of this is nonsense. We're talking, as you just have, about where the majority of our information comes from. I always love a methodological question, and I always love a bit of myth busting on this show. It's one of the things that we do. And with so much kind of coalescing around this story, how do you go about separating the fact and the fiction? And this is a kind of a question that you and I, as historians, will probably have a good sense of the answer. But I'm keen for our listeners to get that appreciation of the research that has to go into getting to the bottom of these things, rather than just sort of pulling out those lazy tropes and perpetuating the frankly more popular, better known, but fundamentally flawed narrative.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me start by saying what that better known and fundamentally flawed narrative is, which is that, Americans have mostly told the story of, well, this was probably an accident, or maybe some drunken British soldiers and sailors did this themselves. There's nothing to see here as far as it having any kind of significance. And so that's the story that winds up in the history books. Most historians are like, well, we don't really know. There doesn't seem to be much here, and the evidence is scattered. But the evidence has been available for a while from, again, if you look at the eyewitnesses, the people who were actually on the ground, granted, most of them favored the British side, but they are there on the ground and they're saying, we caught people in the act. We saw the fire break out in multiple places at once. The Americans had been saying for months that they were going to burn New York City on their way out. Clearly, this was a deliberate act. And look, arson even nowadays is a very difficult crime to prove. By its nature, the evidence is destroyed, for the most part, as it happens. So it's very difficult to make an accusation like this stick. But I think that there's been far too much of an effort to ignore what those eyewitnesses said they saw. And I did my best to corroborate, to match stories up against one another, and also to provide context. What was going on in the minds of Washington and his troops? What were the attitudes in those days of, behind burning cities and whether that was a proper thing to do in wartime, right? So by providing some political and military context, that was it was one of the tools that I used to kind of say, well, how reliable is this evidence? And if a specific person was accused of having set the fire, then I tried to look into their background and say, well, is this the kind of person who would be so radical that they would participate in this planned, coordinated action to destroy this city?
I'm going to go very off-piste here and talk about fires more broadly. And I don't mean in a sort of firefighty, our co-host Liam Telfer kind of sense, but particularly about the way in which fires get utilized. I'm thinking here of an episode that regular listeners of the show will be fairly familiar with, which is the Siege of San Sebastian in 1813, where the British lay siege to the town catches fire, the British then assault the town, and the story that gets perpetuated by the Spanish population is that the British burn the place down deliberately as an act of vandalism and fundamentally a piece of sort of economic warfare against their own allies to prevent San Sebastian from becoming a prominent port and a sort of an economic rival to some of the ports on the British south coast. Now, that's a perception that is deeply rooted in the local history, and it cannot be countered with fact. Fundamentally, it is that kind of that deeply seated and that much of a sort of an intrinsic belief. We do know from the historical record that it is absolutely nonsense. The town was on fire before the British go in, and in fact, they delay their assault because the streets around the breaches are on fire. So we know that that wasn't the case. Not to say that atrocities aren't committed in the aftermath of the siege that need to be acknowledged, but the British don't burn down the town, is my point. And yet the belief is there that they did, which raises a question about a sort of an inclination to almost weaponize these events and to spin them for their own means. To use a very sort of out of period example, the Great Fire of London becomes part of these sort of much bigger conversations about fear of Catholicism and popish plots and all the rest of it. Is that just opportunism because there's always somebody who's willing to be that opportunistic pain of a person who will utilize that? And I pick my words delicately here. Or is there something deeper about fires? Is there something about the nature of a fire and the horror of it that makes people inclined to utilize it a little bit more?
I think that's definitely true. I mean, look, it is true that accidental fires are particularly likely to happen during wartime, right? And so, and people's fears are raised during wartime. There's always going to be a temptation to blame Catholics or enslaved Black people, right? So, a comparison that a lot of Americanists would use is 1741 and the so-called Negro Conspiracy, in which there are a series of fires that are then blamed on a network of Black and white and Catholic people who were conspiring to destroy New York City from within. And so there is something, I mean, fire is, I mean, you have to just picture like how terrifying fire would have been in the 18th century. There's a book by these two scholars with the last name Hazen that says it's the equivalent of the fear of nuclear power and nuclear fission nowadays, right? Like something that's like useful for fuel, but if it gets out of control, it will destroy everything, right? And so and so once a fire occurs, yeah, it's not even necessarily opportunistic as so much as sort of almost instinctual is, oh, who can we blame for this? Even if it's just, well, we can blame neglect and try and up our game as far as firefighting going forward, right? So, sometimes there's a useful civic impulse that comes out of the fear and anguish and grief that comes in the aftermath of a fire. And so we might be tempted to say in 1776, these British and loyalist people who have just seen a fifth of their new prize burned down, to say, ah, yes, it was rebels who had squirreled themselves away, and who had done this. Um, and so for this reason, historians have dismissed a lot of these accounts as, oh, they've just cooked up a conspiracy theory. This is their paranoia talking. There's nothing more to it than that. And that narrative also serves the American interest in saying, ah, yes, Washington, the great father of our country, couldn't possibly have burned New York City. He was such a noble guy. You'll even see British historians in the late 19th century, joining in and saying, oh, yes, Washington, he seems like such a gentleman. Like, I don't think he would have countenanced this. Who is it? Lecky says that. And then there's another prominent British historian. I'm blanking on it right now. But yeah, so it's this super interesting phenomenon, and the gravity of Washington's reputation and wanting to protect Washington's reputation, it can't be ignored as far as that goes. But at the same time, right, if you look at the American correspondence, Nathaniel Greene is urging Washington to burn New York City behind him. After the fire happens, he's writing to his cousin, and this letter doesn't get discovered by historians or it's not widely known by historians until the 1940s. But Washington himself is saying, well, Congress ordered me not to burn New York City, and I thought it was a terrible mistake, but I didn't do it. And then a paragraph later, he's like, oh yeah, by the way, I forgot to mention, Providence or some good honest fellow has done what we didn't, what we were unwilling to do ourselves. In other words, God, an accident, right? Or some good honest fellow. Not anyone Washington knows, not anyone Washington might have ordered to do it, right? His plausible deniability is very important here. But he says, oh yeah, isn't this a good thing that New York City has burned down? And so I don't think it's me kind of reading backwards from a conspiracy theory to kind of say, I think the evidence suggests, et cetera, et cetera. There are other pieces of very good evidence, I think, that suggests that there was something behind this. In June of 1777, a spy named Abraham Patton goes to the gallows. And according to, admittedly, a loyalist newspaper account, on the gallows, he admits not just to having been a spy for the Americans, he tried to bribe a British grenadier, et cetera, but he also says that he was one of the people who had burned down New York City, and he refuses to name his accomplices. Now, the evidence is quite clear that he was a spy for the Americans. You can see that in a variety of forms of diaries and correspondence. Very little evidence that he had definitely, except for that account that he had burned New York City, but it's fascinating. And then a couple weeks later, Washington is writing to John Hancock, the president of the Continental Congress, and they're saying, okay, the guy's left behind a wife and 4 children. Let's get them some money, but let's kind of do it under the table, given the line of work he was in. Again, that might prove nothing more than that he was a spy, but it suggests, given that he was also part of a plot to maybe blow up the magazines in New Brunswick in coordination with an American attack on the British position there, that maybe he was a kind of saboteur specialist of some kind. Fascinating figure, Abraham Patton. I tried to track him all the way across Pennsylvania and Baltimore and the Waxhaws region of the Carolinas. One of the people who I got most fascinated by. But like, where are all these hints come from? I mean, if the British were trying to coordinate a kind of conspiracy theory about who burned New York City, they didn't do a very good job of it, because they didn't. It wasn't a very organized, like, constant drumbeat of the Americans did this, the Americans did this. They basically drop it. But all these hints have been left there in the primary sources, which really, on both the American and the British side, suggesting that the Americans understood that this was strategically a good thing to do. Now, Washington may not have ordered it himself. It might be that some of his men and some civilians did this in defiance of his orders. But either way, it was probably somebody who hated the British, right, and wanted to see the Americans win, who had burned New York City in order to deprive the British of their prize. And if anything, in the book, I criticized the British for not making enough of a big deal about this, right? Like they have an investigation in 1776, but then they drop it and don't publicize it. Now, later on, a few weeks later, and then later on, the Americans will say, well, look, they investigated and didn't find anything, so it must be that there's nothing there. And then the British weirdly investigated again in October of 1783 when the war is all over and the evacuation is about to finish. They investigated again, but then news of the final treaty being signed comes in and then they drop it then too. So people keep looking at this and well, say, well, if there was something there, the British would have come forward and said, look, we have all this evidence and the Americans definitely did it, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, that investigation in 1783, they interview 40 witnesses and most of them insist, yes, this fire was definitely done on purpose. And the only people who say, well, maybe it was an accident were either New York legislators, or they were people who intended to stay and live in America, or who eventually made that decision, or who kind of were wishy-washy about it, or who gave testimony in other places, like in their loyalist claims that, oh yeah, when the city was burned deliberately, et cetera, et cetera. So they kind of contradict what they said in their testimony. So so the British do turn up all this evidence, that the Americans had done this, that people knew specific people who had committed this act, but then the British don't press the investigation or try and make a big deal out of it. They have good reasons for this in both 1776 and 1783 to drop the matter. So as a result, they sort of cede the field to the Americans to interpret and define the fire as they wanted to, which was to say it was an accident and Washington certainly wasn't to blame. Now, over the years, every 20 years or so, some historian will pop their head up and say, yeah, the Americans probably did do this, and it was, it's a scorched earth tactic. It's just like Moscow in 1815, and why not? Why shouldn't the Americans have burned New York City? The British, after all, had burned a bunch of cities. Maybe this was the Americans, kind of pursuing their military advantage in that way. But those historians are always kind of lone voices in the wilderness. And the vast majority of the gravity goes towards saying, nope, Washington must have been blameless. There's nothing to see here. I mean, it's uncomfortable already for Americans to tell New York City's story during the Revolutionary War for reasons we were discussing at the beginning of this conversation. But to say that the Americans burned their own city in this indiscriminate way that made life miserable for a lot of civilians, both loyalist and not, right? To say that the Americans had also committed wartime atrocities, which we know they did, right? They burned tons of Native American villages, for instance. They also committed other kinds of atrocities during the war. We know that the Americans weren't blameless, but if you were an American and your patriotism is wrapped up in the Declaration of Independence and and the American war for independence, which is so wrapped up in the story of the country's origins, and Washington remains this kind of incredibly respected figure. If you're an American, it's very difficult to fit in this more anomalous story into that more patriotic narrative.
Pay no attention to the arsonist behind the curtain,
Who may have been Washington himself.
who may have been Washington
And
himself.
what's so fascinating, right, is we celebrate Nathan Hale, who is this kind of like, not very effective spy who was hanged the next day after the fire. He probably was not involved in the business of setting New York on fire, but this relatively minor figure, just because he happened to go to Yale and, and some of his college friends wanted to make sure he would be remembered forever. He quotes from Addison's Cato, but so did Patton, I think. So did Abraham Patton, right? The Hessian and British officers who observed his hanging were like, yeah, this guy went to the gallows as a gentleman, and he quoted this kind of patriotic line that also resembles Addison's Cato, but Patton never becomes famous. He's really only mentioned like one or two times in the historic record, in relation to and he just becomes not famous at all. And I think Patton deserves to be more famous than Hale.
Absolutely. No, he sounds like a fascinating figure. Okay, you keep going back to the people who suffered because of this, and I do want to talk about that. I want to get on that in a second, but I have a quick question that your talk about sort of blame and neglect and all of that brought up. Are there any efforts on that night to fight this fire?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So there was a fire chief appointed, a tinman named John Baltus Dash. And actually, he later testifies that he knew this fire was coming and buried his valuables in the backyard 2 days before the fire broke out because he had heard all of these rumors that the Americans were about to do this. Then the fire happens and he's in charge. The commandant, his boss, was a Scottish officer named General James Robertson. He had actually been living in Manhattan and had a mansion along Broadway because he was a sort of barrack master general going back to the 7 Years' War. And he's a commandant in New York City for much of the war. So he is in charge. He's down there on the scene and helping to fight the fire. And actually, he later claims that he allowed the fire to burn his house while diverting it from the more important commercial areas of New York City. And he actually makes a claim on the British government on that basis. So he's fighting the fire. There are 4 regiments of troops located near, 4 regiments of soldiers British soldiers located near New York City. And some of them are pressed into service to help fight the fire. Most of the army is further up Manhattan with General Howe, but there are 4 regiments that are stationed near the city who are able to help. And then this fire rages for 10 to 12 hours. At some point, the British warships send boats with sailors aboard who also kind of come ashore and help in firefighting efforts. And normally in an 18th century fire, any civilians that were around would have also pitched in at least to carry water from a water source to the fire engines and then pump water onto the fire. But of course, New York City at that point is heavily depopulated. There couldn't have been more than 5,000 civilians, if that. I mean, the British had just taken the city 6 days later. The Loyalists were only just starting to come back. So there were very few civilians in town. Later on, it's suggested that Washington had deliberately removed all the bells from the churches in order to melt them into cannon. But the effect of removing those bells is that there's no way to sound the alarm in the middle of the night and wake up civilians and have them fight this fire. And as fire scientists nowadays know, like if you don't fight a fire within a certain time period, it achieves flashover and then becomes almost impossible to extinguish unless you create fire breaks or the wind happens to shift, right? Like squirting little bits of water on the fire at that point is not going to do anything. So the firefighters do miss their window and it becomes a kind of out of control conflagration. But there is at least an effort on the part of civilians, most of whom were presumably loyalist, and British soldiers and sailors to try and put this fire out. And the British later brag about this and kind of say, well, clearly we didn't want the city to burn. We did our utmost to try and put this thing out.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier, right, that no one dies that night as on account of the fire, except if they're thrown into the fire or bayoneted by angry British redcoats. But the way you argue this fire in your book, you can trace kind of a 7 year, 8 year, 9 year legacy of casualties by this, because this affects marginalized people more than anyone else, right? It burns down a huge swath of working class, and it doesn't get rebuilt until after the war. So, and one of the things I really enjoy about your book is that you use it to sort of talk about the marginalized people and to use the fire to, and forgive me for this pun, but to shine light on these marginalized people and their stories. So, talk us through, I mean, how you made that decision, where you came across it, because right, these are the people that it's hard to find resources about anyway, let alone after a fire, and how the fire sort of helps us understand their war.
Yeah. I mean, you're making me feel guilty that I didn't spend more time on the kind of aftermath and what the physical space of Canvastown looked like after the fire. I just didn't focus my energy that way. And actually, the pandemic prevented me from doing some of the research that would have really been able to allow me to flesh that out. But I do still talk about marginalized people of various kinds because I'm interested in whether they played a role in burning New York City. So one example is that in the British newspapers, and Edmund Burke will later talk about this on the floor of Parliament, the first incendiary who was caught by the British was said to have been a woman, smutted over with soot in some basement or something behind St. Paul's Cathedral. She and a bunch of men are in there. She's kneading flammable material into balls and et cetera, et cetera. And the British soldiers catch her and these other men, and she kind of pleads for her life, but they may well have thrown her into the fire and killed her. This would have been the first American woman to be killed by British soldiers. during the Revolutionary War if this story is actually true. Now, we don't know her name. We don't know whether she was a working class individual, et cetera, et cetera. We don't even know whether she had been a New York resident or whether she, had somehow been had been part of the American army and had been left behind or something like that. We know very little about her, except that she becomes sort of famous by Burke talking about her on the floor of Parliament. So that's one example of like, okay, we don't think about women participating in warfare in this way. We know it happens, right? But we don't have many stories of it, at least from the Revolution, right? And women are often women who do this kind of thing are often characterized as monstrous, right? You think of the depiction of women who are involved in the French Revolution or in the Commune of 1879, et cetera, right? Women who overstep the bounds of gender and participate in warfare are considered monstrous. But here this woman is, and if we could reconstruct her thinking, how interesting would that be, right? What is a woman's perspective on war? When war comes to your hometown, what kind of action might you take? Are you just going to flee? Or what would it mean if you took a stand and then tried to burn the city down rather than let the British take it? So that's something that's of real interest to me. Another figure that I focused on is there's a group of 8 men who were said to have rowed from Paulus Hook, New Jersey, across the Hudson River, landed on the shores of Manhattan, and then burned New York City. So it's 8 men. Only 6 of them come back because 2 of them were caught and thrown into the fire. And one of them is described as mulatto, in other words, mixed race. Now, I then went back and said, well, who is stationed at Paulus Hook? It was a regiment from New London, Connecticut. Now, New London, Connecticut would suggest, okay, that person might have been of African descent if they're described as mulatto, but they also might have been of Pequot descent, let's say, right? There were a number of indigenous peoples who still lived in New London County in the 1770s, and so this man might have been of indigenous descent, right? So what did it mean for this group of Connecticut men, right? What was it that New Englanders hated about New York, right? That might have motivated them. Why would men of color have joined the American army in 1775 or 1776? And what would their motivation have been? How would they have seen this? What did it mean that we find a mixed race man holding a torch and burning buildings under the aegis of the Continental Army, right? Fascinating. Abraham Van Dyke was more prominent. He was a captain of the Grenadiers, but he was a tavern keeper, right? Longtime resident of New York City. He's held in a British prison for almost 2 years and was accused of having set this fire. So once these names appear, I say, well, okay, the British accused them of having burned New York City. We don't know if that accusation was correct or not, but even so, I wanted to reconstruct their social world and kind of say, what does war look like from the bottom, right? Because so often we rely on military records to tell the story of what happened during war. We rely on generals, we rely on the reports that are sent to the political leadership. Sometimes we get the perspective of ordinary soldiers if they were literate and kept a good diary. So it's not as if we don't get the perspective of a rank and file soldier, and sometimes we get the perspective of ordinary civilians as well. So for me, using this flashbulb moment, from a city that that had just changed hands, and to kind of get as much of a perspective on the ground as I could of what did loyalists on the ground think? What did people of color on the ground think? What did Hessian soldiers think? What did women think? What does the experience of war and occupation look like? I'm not telling that story fully, but I'm telling a snapshot version of this story. As this fire happens, and this fire mostly has an effect on civilian homes, right? As you said, it doesn't have much of a military effect, but it has an effect on thousands of civilians, right? If you think about if 800 buildings burn down and you multiply that, let's say an average household has 5 people in it, you're talking about thousands of people that would have been affected by this fire in a sort of permanent way, some of whom had already been uprooted and had fled New York City months before. But nevertheless, to kind of shine a light on the refugeeism that results as a result of war, the way that war can create both opportunities but also further problems for the enslaved, for women, for free people of color, for ordinary soldiers, for working class civilians, for anyone who's caught in the middle. right? To be able to tell a story of the revolution that looks like that, I'd like to think that that's a contribution that I'm making. I have nothing against what's called maps and chaps history, right? I've learned a ton from military historians, but I also think there's all sorts of interesting work being done from the perspective of war and society. And I came to this not as a military historian, although Gary Gallagher, the American Civil War historian, was on my dissertation committee. So I'd learned from military historians in graduate school, but to kind of come up with this story that I saw as being on the frontier of military history, but also the social and political and cultural history that I had done before, to kind of say, like, okay, this was a city that had been involved in political mobilization, in resistance up till 1775. Then the war comes down, but we're still living in that world. It's only about a year later, and the war has come to New York City's doorstep, and there are still real people living in this space. And you're never going to see a battle map of the New York City fire. It's not part of a formal engagement in any respect. And yet it is this kind of fascinating thing that happens in the midst of a war. And what did it mean for the people who experienced it? And as you said, had to live with the experience of that having happened for many years later because they had been displaced and burned out of their homes.
There is something both horrifying and wonderfully fitting about your research on this disaster being impeded by the pandemic coming down, yet another sort of that moment of, oh, okay, yeah, I know what it feels like to live through interesting times, very much. I think that is actually all we have time for. But thank you so very much for this. It was utterly fascinating, and I think that, especially at the end, that sort of call to arms for the sort of military social cultural blend. If only there was some sort of overarching narrative called history that we could just talk about, right? Rather than pigeonholing ourselves one way or the other. All right. You have been listening to Benjamin Carp. He is a professor of history at the City University of New York, or CUNY's Brooklyn College, and the Graduate Center, my alma mater. And he is the author of three books: Rebels Rising, Cities in the American Revolution, Defiance of the Patriots, The Boston Tea Party, and the Making of America, and The Great New York Fire of 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution. And clearly, we need to get you on to talk about good titles as well, because all three of those, but especially your first two, just really nail it. But thank you so very much, and hope you had a good time.
Yeah, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. You got me thinking about things in new ways, and that's always a good sign.
That is always a good sign, and that's sort of what we strive to. And when we say, this is effectively like, scholars having a drink at the pub after the conference, we don't just do that to drink and talk. We also do that because the ideas come out of that, and it's always a bonus when they do. All right, folks, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.
If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NatWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff: Adam Coslin, the Marshals: Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion of Scholars: Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.